Um, this is the first of the beginning of the mini symposium on climate change, public opinion, public views. And there's kind of a theme across this mini symposium of what do we know and what do we need to know. As you're well aware, there's been a lot of concern, interest, publicity about public views on climate change, starting, well, for a long time in the academic world, but starting with the flap about the University of East Anglia emails in the fall and continuing. And I want to thank Aaron McWright and Sandy Marquardt, who's over there, who really organized this session. I'm just the figurehead. Because we really have some of the best people in the United States, or actually in the world, working on this issue. And so we have two sessions at which we'll have paper presentations, so we have plenty of time for discussion. And then we break, and in the afternoon, there's a plenary for the meeting at noon with lunch. At noon, we're going to reconvene, I'm not sure in what room, we'll check that out, and have kind of an extended discussion of those two questions. What do we know about public opinion, public views about climate change? And what do we need to know in terms of programs and policies and the direction the country and the world is taking with regard to that issue? So that's our agenda, and I'm very, very pleased and looking forward to this. And our first presenter is Riley Dunlap, who I often say knows more about public opinion on the environment than anybody else in the world. He's one of the pioneers in environmental sociology and has done great work in this area throughout my entire career. He somewhat precedes me in this business. And he's going to talk about some of his latest work done with Aaron McWright here at MSU. Right?
Thank you, Tom.
I should mention that we are recording, so you got to keep the mic pointed at you somehow. You can carry it around.
I don't think I should stand in front of the screen. I learned that in Speaking 101. Would this work okay? I don't want to foul things up. Oh, it's not too high. Good. Well, I'm happy to be here. Sadly, Aaron McWright has a day job here at Michigan State, and he's teaching right now, but he's an ex-student of mine from Washington State University, and I'm so thrilled that we celebrated his tenure and promotion last night at dinner. So, but anyway, he's been a very good co-author. And can we click now? Oh, that would... He's playing with his telephone. He's going to be my clicker. Actually, this presentation is going to build upon and update an article that we published a couple of years ago. We've now added 2 more years of data to it. Next one. So my purpose, am I out of your way? Okay. My purpose is to examine recent trends in public opinion. And I have to use the term global warming because Gallup started using that term. They're not using climate change, and it would be foolish for me to talk about climate change when every question uses the term global warming. We're going to look at trends for over a decade, and then I'm going to make comparisons between Republicans and Democrats because I think it reveals a lot more than the superficial trends do. Next. So all of these data come from Gallup national surveys employing telephone interviews, nationally representative samples. For reasons I won't explain, I'm the, quote, Gallup scholar for environment, so that's how I get the data easily. The national results should be accurate within plus or minus 3%. Oh, and I forgot to set my watch here. Okay. And we have a 1997 survey that was conducted in November. All the others are conducted in March so they can put out stuff for Earth Day. Next. Okay, let's look at the first question. Now you can read this, obviously. So what I want to focus on is the responses to the first, those who choose the first response. That the effects of global warming have already begun to happen. Okay? Now let's look at the next one then. So when you look at this, you can see that there was quite a jump there from 97 to 2001, but you never put too much faith in just 2 years. But over time, up through 2008, it would be fair to say that there was a very modest but fairly steady upward increase and then a quite precipitous fall the last 2 years, okay? But we can gain some insight. Who fell, so to speak? Next one. Here we see the Democrats in blue and the Republicans in red. And again, what you can see is a pretty consistent upward trend for the Democrats, although they fell the last 2 years. But the Republicans, again, have really fallen substantially, particularly in the last 2 years, but a third. So now we've got well over twice as many, almost 2.5 times the percent of Democrats and Republicans thinking global warming's already begun. That sort of helps account for that downward decline. It wasn't spread throughout the public. Next. Here's another question. This one's shorter, so I'll read it. Thinking about what's said in the news, and in your view, is the seriousness of global warming generally exaggerated, generally correct, generally underestimated? We're going to look at the percent who say generally exaggerated. And again, you can see this. Quite an upward shift. I have people telling me, oh, they don't pay attention to Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and talk about CRU and ClimateGate and all this. I don't know. We'll see. Let's go to the next one. Again, we can see, loosely speaking, the Democrats, although they've come up in the last 2 years, have fairly consistently rejected that view. It's really grown nicely among Republicans. And again, we have almost 3 times as the percentage of Republicans as Democrats saying climate change or global warming's been exaggerated. Next. Here's one. We get at this whole issue of the scientist. What do you think is most accurate? Most scientists believe that global warming is occurring, not occurring, they're unsure. Let's look at this one. This is most scientists believe or agree. So you can see quite a drop since 2008. It wasn't used in 2009. Gallup doesn't use all these items every year. Let's again shift now to the parties. You can see this past, well, in 2010, there was a noticeable drop among Democrats, but a really substantial drop among Republicans again. Okay, next. Here's an item gets at the anthropogenic origins of climate change. Do you believe increases in the temperature are due more to the effects of pollution? I wish I wasn't involved in creating this wording, unfortunately. I was living in Europe at the time, and anyway, I wouldn't have used the word pollution, but that or natural changes in the environment. So, oops. Again, we see, especially in the 2008, but really this past year, noticeable drop. But next, we can see, not surprisingly, almost all of the decline has been due to Republicans. Democrats have stayed pretty stable. Okay, next. And finally, do you think that global warming will pose a serious threat to you or your way of life in your lifetime? That was going up fairly substantially through 2008, and now it's really taken quite a hit. And guess what? The hits come primarily from self-identified Republicans. By the way, independents always fall in between, but a little closer to one party than the other, depending on the question. Okay, so so far we've got this pattern where climate change concern or concern about global warming was generally increasing to about 2008. Now it's taken quite a drop, but that drop is almost, at least let's say predominantly due to a decline in Republicans, self-identified Republicans concerned about climate change. Let's go to the next one. What we've looked at are just visual analyses. So let's go to correlational data and correlate the responses to the party preference, Republican, Democrat, and the responses to these items. Next one. Okay, this is really small. Let's basically, you said don't stray from the microphone. Yeah, okay. Geez, thanks. So
Just pull up on it.
Being Yeah, a night owl and shifting to Eastern time, I'm not awake yet. I never, brilliant thought, thank you. Okay. I have most faith in 2001, and basically what you can see, most of the correlations are in the 0.14, well, up to 0.26, and you go, ooh, that's not very strong. For social science, these are all statistically significant. But let's just quickly contrast 2001 with 2010. 4.6, 4.64, 3.8, 3.8, 3.9, 3. The correlations have at least doubled. So as obviously what you would expect from seeing the divergence on the graph, the correlations got stronger. Next. Now, of course, there are a lot of factors that can influence both party identification and views of global warming. And as sociologists, we're always controlling for demographic characteristics, age, gender, and so forth, to see if it's spurious. So can we explain away that party preference, views of global warming relationship? Next. And again, I apologize, this is a little smaller than I thought. The simplest way to do this, if we look, we controlled for sex, gender, age, race, income, and education. And here we see the effect of party by itself and then the effect of party controlling for these things. And if you read across here, there's just very little effect. 0.43 drops to 0.41. Oh, by the way, I should have added, this is for March 2010 only. But we've done it for other years, and you get similar effects. Anyway, the point is you can control for these basic demographic characteristics, and it has virtually no effect. The relationship between party identification and perceptions of global warming or opinions hold up remarkably well. So next. Now there's another interesting thing that we can do, though. An early study, I believe it was John Krosnick, found that partisan differences were stronger for respondents who claimed to know very little about global warming, which is interesting. Like, oh, if you don't know anything about it, you just sort of adopt the party view or something. Therefore, we examined the relationship here, controlling on another item I haven't shown you yet. Gallup asked people, how well do you think you understand global warming? And what I'm going to do now is show you the prior kinds of results, the correlations, but for two categories, those who think they understand global warming very well or fairly well, we just created a dichotomy, versus those who claim to understand it not very well or not at all. Okay? Thanks. Here's a tough one, but it's to read again, but to simplify it, can you tell the difference between bold and non-bold back there? Okay, the bold correlations are at least significant at the 0.05 level. And the easiest thing, up at the top are those individuals who report understanding global warming not very well or not, are not at all. For them, the correlations between party and perceptions, opinions are quite low and often not significant. But when we get to those who think they understand global warming very well or fairly well, every correlation is significant, and they're all stronger. So it's those folks who feel they understand global warming well who exhibit the partisan differences more than the others. Quite the opposite of the prior study. And I think our data is far stronger than the data from that study, so I'm going with this. Okay, next. Our results thus show that partisan differences are stronger among individuals, as I said. And here's the important thing. We did a similar analysis with education, college graduates and above versus less in college. And we found a very similar pattern. The more educated people are more likely to exhibit stronger partisan differences than the less educated people. So it sort of suggests the importance of cue taking. People who are really interested in stuff, we know college-educated people are more likely to read and be in contact with the media and so forth. Those are the folks where the partisan differences really come out. And one might argue, well, that's because the Republicans are more likely to watch one particular TV network than others, listen to various radio commentators and so forth. and of course follow their party leaders. Okay, next. How are we doing? I got time for those 6 or not?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, now we're going to get to the interesting part, and I'm going to give you my interpretation of what's kind of going on. As Tom said, I've been studying this stuff a long time, actually since the study of student eco-activists at the University of Oregon in 1970. That's when I got interested in environment. It was my high school project. Yeah. Kidding. Okay. I hate to, when you don't want to stand up saying, I've been doing this for 40 years. You're like, oh my God, no wonder my leg's hurting. But anyway. Okay. In the 1970s, environmental issues were relatively nonpartisan. In fact, we didn't find very significant differences. Often, the relationships between party identification and views of environmental issues were not statistically significant in all kinds of studies. But beginning with the Reagan era, the view of government as the problem, not the solution, saw Republican support really start to decline significantly among political elites, namely those in Congress and so forth. And if you look at the voting records of members of Congress, like the League of Conservation Voters and so forth, you see a gradual divergence by the 80s. It's getting quite strong, with Democrats having the more, quote, pro-environmental records than Republicans. But until the 90s, the differences in support for environmental protection among the general public was really quite modest. It still sometimes was significant, but often not statistically significant. That began to change. The difference, let's go to the next one here. Oh, excuse me. In the 90s, as part of this reaction to the growing globalization of environmental awareness, and actually in articles what I say, well, with Aaron, the combination of the decline of the Soviet Union and the loss of the, quote, red threat or the red scare, combined with Rio Earth Summit and this threat of growing the globalization of environmental regulations and so forth, led the conservative movement to substitute a green scare or a green threat for the red threat. And if you read the literature that I do, you will find many references to this coming out of conservative think tanks and in conservative magazines, et cetera. So the American conservative movement, by which I mean the Heritage Foundation, Cato, the funders, Richard Mellon, Scaife, the David Koch, and so forth that you've been hearing more about lately, they launched what I believe is accurate to call an anti-environmental counter-movement, really spearheaded by these key think tanks. And of course, they more recently have been joined by conservative pundits such as Rush Limbaugh and Fox News, essentially everyone. Next. Conservatives learned, however, in the Reagan years, that to attack environmental protection head-on produces a backlash. Some of you other people who have been around a while might remember James Watt and Ann Gorsuch. They had to resign from EPA, the Department of Interior. The membership of Sierra Club and so forth really went up because Reagan was perceived accurately as trying to dismantle environmental regulations. And that didn't fly. So by the 90s, people learned that rather than attack the regulations per se, you attack the science, you attack the evidence. You say, we don't need this regulation because they're exaggerating. We don't need to control carbon emissions because it's all a hoax, et cetera. Okay? These efforts have had considerable success, particularly focused on climate change, and that's been the key issue because climate change, of course, is the mother of all environmental issues, has the greatest regulatory implications and so forth, and it's really become the key issue for conservative opposition. I think they've been quite successful in what people call manufacturing uncertainty, putting out constant everything from Wall Street Journal editorials to all kinds of studies to getting on Fox. You manufacture uncertainty. The IPCC is not accurate, it's manipulated, it's a liberal plot, et cetera, et cetera. I would argue the evidence of the effectiveness of this, we have at least two bodies. First, the media, many people have done media studies. And these studies show that the US media has been quite likely to portray climate change as with, two separate issues. You've got the IPCC over here, and you've got Patrick Michaels over here to give the other view, this balanced stuff. And of course, that's gotten stronger with Fox and so forth. And compared to other nations, these studies show they've done a much better job of reporting on the consensus rather than these competing views, a lack of certainty. Secondly, I don't have any slides from it, but lots and lots of international, cross-national studies show that the US public is much less concerned about climate change than our publics in other developed countries. We often come out looking like a third world country relative to other nations in the world in terms of citizen concern about climate change. I would say this to me is at least some evidence of the success of this campaign. Okay, I believe our results suggest that Republicans and the general public have taken their cues on climate change from leaders of their party. Now it's almost a litmus test, and you see now Lindsey Graham has just recently resigned, withdrawn from trying to work with the Democrats. And you read these new planks for what it means to be a good Republican, and opposing carbon emissions is a core plank in there. Obviously, we've got people, again, everyone on Fox News, basically, Rush Limbaugh talking about hoax, liberal plot, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Republicans are just exposed to this overwhelmingly negative view of the IPCC and climate change. They've really bought this view that it's much to do about nothing. Next. Now, of course, you could say, well, how about Democrats? They get their cues. Why, and depending on your view, why are Democrats still buying into this crap? Or if you're a conservative. However, I question whether the Democratic Party in Congress has been nearly as obviously supportive of climate change as Republicans have been opposed to climate change. So for a Democrat, who do you take your cues from? I mean, Harry Reid has not been a font of support for climate change. And even Al Gore, who the conservatives love to bash, of course, I would argue the inconvenient truth has probably reached far, far fewer people than does Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and so forth. So this is how we've ended up, I believe, with this incredible partisan polarization. And, I guess it's good for politics, but it has clearly major implications for policy making. And I guess I'll wrap up by saying Obama et al. Have their work cut out for them. Thank you.
I was mentioning the results to a political scientist, and he said, well, and I framed it the way you did in terms of Republicans versus Democrats. He said, well, if you looking at that in Congress is one thing because party ID is highly stable. Looking at that in the general public is a different matter because party ID shifts a lot from year to year. And so, and I know the answer to this question in part because I've read the papers, but does this hold up if you look at conservative liberal instead of Republican Democrat? And how much does party ID shift?
This is one of the interesting things, and kind of zooming through. In the early days, you typically found a modest but statistically significant difference among self-identified liberals and conservatives, even among the general public. Ideology was always stronger than party identification. But on this one, party has basically become as strong when it comes to climate change. The differences are quite similar, as Tom points out, if we look at self-identified liberal and conservative. And I'm not sure I would buy that thing that party is so unstable. I think independents move back and forth. But those people who say they're Republicans or Democrats, obviously we don't have trend data. So I mean, we don't have panel data. We don't have the same people over all these years. So I can't really answer that, but I would find that highly dubious.
The proportion of Democrat and Republican states relatively?
It's varied. I don't have that right here, but actually it varies a fair, not a lot, but percents over the years. But the fact that the results always stay the same suggests to me that they're pretty robust. of those people in any given year who feel they're Republicans are Democrats, we get the same, we get this pattern whether it's 26 or 31 or something like that. So, but I just want to point out, this is unique, that party identification predicts at least as well as political ideology. And that tells us, again, something about the degree to which it's become almost a litmus test for Republicans to reject climate change.
How strongly correlated are those two variables?
Party Oh, thanks for asking. Oh. Yeah, I forget, but I'm sure it's now at 0.3 or 0.2. It was, last year it was 0.41732. No, I'm kidding.
Not as strong as I would have guessed for you.
Yeah, obviously it's pretty significant. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you looked at the correlations between the money spent by fossil fuel industry through the think tanks and the public opinion poll, because it seems like, to me, just on the surface, this is one of the primary cases where you can actually see the purchasing of data, right? Because I would guess that as that money has gone up, the trend lines have gone down, although there's a party split on it there.
It's really tough. I mean, you raised, Aaron and I also write other things on the kind of climate denial machine industry, whatever you want to call it. It's so hard to trace the money. Clearly, the activity's gone up. So, as everyone knows, ExxonMobil was the key funder, but now we get the David Koch and Richard Mellon-Scaife. These are the folks who fund Americans for Prosperity and some of the other groups that are quite active these days in opposing climate change. And the total amount of money, it's just so hard to trace that. But clearly, we see a correlation. Once Obama came in, and conservatives, Republicans could no longer, fossil fuel industry, relied on the Bush administration to basically keep anything from happening in terms of meaningful regulations. It's understandable. It's like the conservative. I think that this is a reasonable statement. The Bush administration, from a sociological standpoint, represented the institutionalization of an anti-environmental movement. I mean, they were in power running things. And when they got pushed out, it's not surprising. Now out here you need the Tea Party, you need all of these kinds of things. So there's been a huge increase in anti-climate change, anti-environmental rhetoric and so forth coming out of conservative think tanks. But to show a specific correlation between funding and that would take data that I don't have.
Just one more comment, which is you commented on how a lot fewer people saw an inconvenient truth and listened to Rush Limbaugh. And I can give a little tidbit from my own experience in Lansing as to just how true that was. I went to the celebration in a theater which held 200 people on a Saturday night. There were about 25 people there, of whom over 5 were people who my wife and I had brought. And it closed after a little over a week because of inadequate attendance.
What about the effect of region?
Region?
Yeah, because the South is typically more anti.
I think you could plot, we haven't done this, but clearly I believe the West Coast would probably score higher and concern about climate change maybe than the East.
Sammy Saran, who is part of the session but because of flight problems can't get here today, so we'll be here tomorrow, actually has a paper looking at some detail at regional differences.
Yes,
It's fascinating, really fascinating. You indicated that this issue, because of its scope, is really a focal point in so many ways. How do you factor in risk perception of change to me, people's perceptions of how it's going to change my life, or whether it's the risk of something happening or the risk of something else happening? How do you factor that into your analysis? And why does this then resonate more than so many other issues have?
well, given that we don't have any risk perception data per se, other than what the item you saw, you could have represented what you, I can't give a meaningful answer to this database. I think we have Tom here has done much more work on risk perception in general. Would it not be fair to say that on typical risk perception items that Republicans, or especially conservatives, tend to score lower, that they're just less worried about that kind of risk? I guess you are more worried about the risk of terrorism and these other things and less worried about environmental risk. We have different views. But
Yeah, I mean, there's two issues I guess I would pull, would summarize from the risk perception literature that I think are fair. First of all, that we used to try to figure out why do women perceive less risk. And when we began to get larger samples, women perceive more risk. You know, this is sort of the literature tried to wrestle with it for a while. Then when we began to get larger data sets, with Linda Kaloff, my wife, and some other colleagues, we published a paper where the working title, although it was published this way, is White Men Are Weird. Because when you begin to get other ethnic groups in the U.S. into the mix, and women, black men, black women, Hispanic women, and white women are all about the same in risk perception. And it's white men. But then if you look more finely at that, it's a subset of white men who feel that basically there are no risks out there. And I think, you know, we haven't been able to go further with this because one of the things that plagues this field is a real lack of funding that allows us to have high-quality, large overtime data sets. That's why the Gallup data is so important. But I suspect it has a lot to do with the same groups that you're seeing. The other thing I would say about the risk perception literature is that risk perception is very strongly related to trust. You know, the whole issue of nuclear power, public opposition to nuclear power, in all the analyses that I've seen is not driven by not understanding the facts, quote unquote, about nuclear power. It's driven by a lack of trust in the nuclear industry. This is what predicts it in the public, a lack of trust in the nuclear industry and a lack of trust in the nuclear regulatory apparatus of the federal government, which, by the way, are seen to be the same thing by the general public. And that really strongly predicts how people feel about nuclear power.
And in this case, I would say the lack on average of conservatives, Republicans trust in the federal government would certainly, you're going to try to develop these programs that deal with climate change. Oh, what a disaster. So, building on what Tom said, I'm staying here extra days so Aaron and I can work on some papers in progress. And I have to take credit for this title. And we're going to give the follow-up for the American Sociological Association. They call it Cool Dudes. The rejection of global warming by white conservative males. So we're adding conservative into the mix, and white conservative males are sort of like in a little land of their own. You know, you can imagine, and we don't have age in there, young testosterone-driven guys at the gym, or, you know, racing, all the things that white males do, you know. So why would they worry about climate change, you know, driving 115 miles an hour on the freeway or something, lifting 400 pounds, you know? You solve climate change with testosterone.
Surely there are some Republicans out there that accept this argument of, you know, global warming, and they want policy change and all that. Have you looked at differences between Republicans who are accepting of this and who do not accept this?
Not in detail yet. One of the problems with the data sets where Gallup uses 1,000 to 1,050 to get plus or minus 3 is, you know, you're going to get down to less than 300 to start with, then males, maybe 160 or something, but that's an excellent answer. That's a kind of classic case. When I was in grad school, we had a thing called median case analysis, and it's almost, you really focus on people who go against the trend. And you know, it hit me, one of the things that we can do is we can pool the data. And we add for each year, so we can create a sample of 10,000. So that's a very nice point, and maybe it'll do something.
I would say anecdotally to that is, we've heard a number of individuals and organizations, corporations, and trade associations say something like this, that we make no judgment about climate change, but the business case dominates or dictates that we need some comprehensive solutions to be able to move ahead. So the uncertainty in the business environment was enough to sway the solution set without making a judgment one way or another, publicly or not publicly, about causality. So I think there's a relationship in there that gets a little bit of what you're talking about. So the perception of, okay, this is a problem, let's move ahead, maybe perceiving the problem set differently than the root cause. So think about that in
There are all
the
kinds of
questioning.
things. One of the first things I would want to look at is children. We hear these stories, how do young children worry about future generations? How do kids come home from school? Daddy, what are you doing about climate change, et cetera? We would need to focus on all those peculiarities. Person's background, being raised in an area that's now, undergoing dramatic changes of some type, whether directly or indirectly due to climate change. All of these can kind of push reality over ideology, to give my perspective. I think I've taken.
Yeah,
I don't want to screw.
we will have plenty of time for discussion, but probably we ought to move on. Thank you, Riley.
Thank you.